has been 9 years, nearly a decade at this point, since we last saw the arrival of a new Volvo S60, the company's small sporty sedan. And finally, we have a new one here for 2019, going into the 2020 model year. Now, this new S60 finally brings the model up to the spec of the rest of the company's range in terms of styling, in terms of interior, equipment. It finally modernizes it because, well, the S60 and the V60 wagon that shares platform with it. I drove the V60 Polestar actually in the last generation, and while it was a really fun car, that interior was not great. Not great. The infotainment system particularly let it down. No one really held the old Volvo system in particularly high regard, I don't think, with the phone number keypad thing and the rotary dial, and wasn't touchscreen, and it was awful. Thankfully, we have the new generation Volvo stuff in here, so we've got the very, very slick portrait style touchscreen in the middle. We've got a digital gauge cluster with a map in there and all that. It's all configurable, and all the other niceties that you get with a new Volvo, like this brilliant Bowers & Wilkins audio system that will actually simulate the acoustics of the Gothenburg Concert Hall, which is really cool. I will say that hip-hop sounds dreadful with that setting on, but rock music, it does make it sort of sound like really big and stadium-y. Now, the new S60 range starts from just $54,990, which is really rather good when you consider the sort of cars it's up against, like the BMW 3 Series and Jaguar XE, both of which have been updated very recently and are worth probably about 10 grand more in starting form for both. This one that I'm in right now is the T5 R design, which is at $64,990 before options and on-roads. And I think that this is probably a real sweet spot in the range. That's because you get all the nice R design touches. There's aluminium finishes in here. You've got leather seats with little bits of cloth on the bolsters and stuff. Really nice interior, sportier wheel, sportier looks on the outside too in terms of the wheel design and bumpers and all of that. I think it looks great and it's well specified. And at $64,990, it's a bit of a bargain. Now, for the real speed freaks out there, you'll probably want to go for the T8. Ironically, I guess, I'm recommending the hybrid as the performance variant, but that's exactly what it is. It has over 300 kilowatts, goes like the clappers. I have driven that drivetrain in the XC90. I'm yet to sample it in the S60, and I'd love to. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge to the Volvo PR people. But even though that's the one for speed freaks out there, it costs more than $20,000 more than this T5R design, and that is going to be hard to justify for most people out there. That's why I think this is probably the pick of the bunch. If you value your sporty driving dynamics and you want something that looks the part, but you don't need all the power in the world, which you don't, quite frankly, I think this is great. It's a 2-litre turbo engine, 8-speed automatic behind it, and standard all-wheel drive. And it's a pretty good drivetrain overall. I mean, it pulls nicely, doesn't sound bad either, makes a pretty nice noise for a 4-cylinder, and you can hear the turbo whistling away, which is really cool. The 8-speed auto behind it is an ACEN unit. It's not quite as sharp and on the money as the ZF 8-speed you'd find in those key rivals, the Jag and the BM that I mentioned before. But it is a pretty good transmission. It's smooth, and that's probably the main thing that you want with an 8-speed automatic like this. The issue comes with aggressive driving. You're best leaving it just to its own devices, because if you try using the paddles, they're pretty dim-witted, and the shifts aren't quite as punctual as you get in the ZF, where it just bangs into them. You do have that little bit of hesitation as it swaps ratios. But overall, it's a pretty good drivetrain. And of course, all-wheel drive is something that it has over the BM and the Jag. So for some of you, that will definitely be a real selling point, and you can feel that all-wheel drive system coming into its own on roads like this one. I'm on Lobethal Road in the Adelaide Hills. Nice tight twisting corners, and you can really put the power on nice and early on the exit from corners, puts it down effectively, and I mean, it gets you up to speed again very nicely. Power's healthy, it's nice and smooth, fairly refined. Just could do with a slightly quicker gearbox, I think, is probably the only real criticism that I have there. There is also, I guess, the fact that you can provoke a little bit of understeer sometimes, but you do have to be driving like a bit of a nonce to really expose it properly. So I will sort of hold back from saying that it is understeery, period. I think you've just got to be, you know, you got to exercise some good judgment, I would say, when you're driving it. I should mention as well that this R-Design variant does have a special Polestar tuned sports mode to it that adjusts all your throttle response, steering, gear changes, all that sort of thing. So that's another little advantage that you do get over other T5 variants, and it probably makes it worth going for this R-Design model as a result. Of course, this isn't a full Polestar version, that's really the T8, and even then that's not a proper Polestar model like the old version of the S60 had, but even still, I think power-wise that's so much more powerful than the old Polestar that no one's really complaining, I don't think. It does handle really nicely, this S60. It's well balanced through the corners. The steering is set at a really nice ratio. I'm actually in just the regular sort of comfort mode right now, not the Polestar sports mode, and it feels really nice. There's a good amount of resistance to it, but it's still quite light, so it's not like some rivals like the Jaguar XE. Not that I've driven the facelifted version of that just yet. I have driven the pre-facelift though, and I am penciled in to drive the 2020 model in a couple of months' time. But that, when you put it in dynamic mode, the steering is way too heavy, I find. Thankfully, you can configure your sports modes and all of that in most of these sorts of cars, and the same it goes with this S60. It does have an individual mode, but in normal comfort, it's perfectly fine. It sort of does everything, and the Polestar mode, I feel you'd really need to be driving it more aggressively than I am right now to get the best out of it. But it rides beautifully, this car. Really well tuned ride. It absorbs just about everything on the surface. It's definitely informative. You can feel what's going on underneath you, but it's just super plush at the same time. Really nice. And through the bends, it just stays pretty flat, which is exactly what you want. Tiny little bit of body roll, not as much as you get in the new 3 Series, and it's probably not as flat as the XE would be, but as it stands, I think it strikes a really good middle point between the 3er and the XE. But even though I feel like it sort of slots in between those two in terms of performance and dynamics and all of that, it undercuts both so significantly by price that I feel it makes probably a better case for itself than either of those two, especially since you're getting the all-wheel drive, you're getting more kit as standard as well. I mean, it's very impressive, this thing. It's really impressive. It's worth noting as well that since the S90 was actually cancelled for Australia earlier this year, this is actually the only Volvo sedan you can now buy. Probably not a bad thing given how much cheaper it is than the S90, while offering, well, all the same stuff in here. The finishes are the same, the levels of equipment exactly the same. It's all very similar, it's just not quite as big, and I don't think many people are really utilising the S90 for what it was intended for, as being a sort of luxury limousine. And so as a result, as much as I liked the S90, I think it's probably a better call that this is the car that Volvo's focusing its efforts on, because, again, so much of a saving for largely the same stuff. I mean, it just makes more sense, doesn't it? especially since the S90 wasn't really selling very well. And I imagine this will probably do a bit better given the 54 grand starting price. I think that's probably going to be the one that's going to entice people most, will be that T5 Momentum base model. But I think if you're serious about your driving, this is probably going to be the one for you, the T5 R Design for $64,990. I think it's a great value buy and stacks up really well and holds its own against its German and British rivals. So that's it, new S60, great car. I love it. I'm having a lot of fun on this road actually through these corners in it. But what do you guys think? It's all well and good me driving it around like this, but would you actually put your money down on one of these, or would you rather have the established 3 Series or the dynamic Jaguar XE? Let me know below. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time.